The cold rain was a brutal assault, each drop a tiny ice pick hammering against my skin as I sprinted across the back parking lot of Bellini's. My threadbare uniform, already soaked through, clung to me like a second, humiliating layer of ice. The late shift had been a relentless marathon, 12 hours on my feet, dodging the whims and impossible demands of entitled diners. All that effort, all that hustle translated into a meager $60 in tips, a pathetic offering against the looming mountain of medical bills that haunted my mailbox back home. Fumbling with numb fingers, I desperately searched for my keys inside the tattered strap of my purse. The flickering amber glow of the street lamp cast an elongated, distorted shadow across the cracked pavement. It stretched and warped, a grim reflection of my own life, stretched thin and twisted by circumstance. The back lot was where the bottom feeders of Bellini's universe parked, darker, further, and decidedly less safe than the valet circle out front. Bellini's was a haven for those who flashed expensive watches and donned tailored suits, for individuals who never bothered to acknowledge the existence of someone like me. To them, I was a mere shadow, a silent ghost gliding between tables, delivering menus and disappearing as quickly as I came. I was the one who wiped down surfaces while they brokered deals that would never, in a million years, touch my world. The sharp crack of a car door slamming behind me shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the cold, wet night, each reverberation a hammer blow to my already frayed nerves. I froze, every muscle coiled tight, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears. The chilling realization washed over me. I was utterly alone. No witnesses, no one to hear my screams swallowed by the storm. Working the late shift in this neighborhood had always been a gamble, a foolish proposition, especially for a woman alone. But when you're a 28-year-old single mother, anchored by a 5-year-old daughter waiting at home with an elderly neighbor and battling diabetes bills that piled up faster than autumn leaves, smart choices were a luxury you simply couldn't afford. I wrestled with the lock, my numb fingers fumbling, trembling so violently that even the simplest movements became Herculean tasks. "Please, just open," I whispered through clenched teeth, the words a desperate prayer carried away by the wind. Then, a sharp, deafening explosion ripped through the air, a jagged tear in the fabric of the night, like lightning splitting the sky. I instinctively dropped to the ground, the keys flying from my grasp and skittering across the slick, rain-soaked pavement. My heartbeat ricocheted inside my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, my breathing ragged as the rain pounded my back like shards of ice. 3 more shots followed in rapid succession, precise and deadly, the kind fired by someone whose hand never wavered, whose soul was as cold and calculating as the gun they wielded. A man shouted, urgent and razor-sharp. I should have scrambled under the car, sought refuge in the shadows, done anything to make myself invisible. That's what a smarter person would have done. But I had never been accused of being smart. Instead, I lifted my head and peered cautiously past the wheel well, trying to make sense of the unfolding chaos. Roughly 20 meters ahead, near the employee entrance, 4 black SUVs were clustered together, their doors flung wide open, the interior lights casting a faint, ethereal glow through the rain. Dark-clad figures moved with the swift, practiced precision of dancers engaged in a deadly tango. And then I saw him, amidst the cacophony of gunfire and shouting. He stood perfectly still, a tall, imposing figure with broad shoulders, his long coat thrown open, revealing a fitted, impossibly expensive suit beneath. The street lamp caught the sharp angles of his face, the defined jawline, the straight, aristocratic nose, the deep, black eyes, the neatly cut hair, his expression disturbingly calm despite the violence erupting around him. I recognized him instantly. Everyone at Bellini's knew Julian Rios. He frequented the restaurant maybe once a month, never often, but always arriving with an undeniable presence that caused the entire staff to hold its breath. The manager personally attended to him, the chef prepared dishes that never appeared on the menu, and the wait staff whispered warnings to one another. Don't stare. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't draw attention. Whispers circulated that he owned half the city, though no one ever dared specify which half. I always assumed it was the half steeped in shadow and danger. Another gunshot cracked the air, closer this time, and one of the men guarding him crumpled to the ground. More shadows surged along the wall, weapons drawn, closing in. An ambush. "Get him in the car now!" someone yelled, the order sharp and desperate. The guards formed a human shield around Julian, trying to push him toward the nearest SUV. But they were too exposed, vulnerable under the relentless hail of bullets. Another man went down, his body hitting the wet asphalt with a sickening thud. The ranks of his protectors dwindled. I should have stayed down, kept my head low, prayed for it all to end without drawing me into its vortex. Lena needed me alive, not brave. My daughter needed me to walk through the front door each night, not be carried into a morgue. But something flickered in Julian's eyes as he glanced at the fallen man. A fleeting flash of pain that contradicted every cold rumor I had ever heard about him. And then he looked up, his eyes locked with mine. Recognition. He remembered me. I was the clumsy waitress who had spilled water all over his date during his last visit, stammering apologies while he studied me with an expression that was equal parts amusement and unreadable calculation. In that split second, a tiny red dot appeared on his chest, a crimson bullseye painted by a laser sight. I didn't think. I didn't weigh my options. I simply moved. Maybe I was just too tired of watching people die for nothing. Maybe it was because, despite everything whispered about Julian Rios, no one deserved to be gunned down in a rain-soaked parking lot like some kind of animal. Or maybe I was just a slave to the same reckless instinct that had guided me through a lifetime of questionable choices. I surged to my feet and ran, my shoes slipping on the slick pavement, my heart drumming like a war drum in my ears. Someone shouted, a word lost in the storm. Maybe a warning, maybe a curse. Couldn't tell. I slammed into Julian just as the shot rang out. The impact sent both of us crashing to the ground. A searing pain tore through my left shoulder, hot and brutal, like a branding iron pressed against my flesh. The world tilted. The pavement rushed up to meet me, but strong arms caught me before I hit the ground. Through the haze of pain, I saw his face, no longer cold and detached, but stunned, almost angry. He said something, his voice sounding muffled, as if coming from underwater. "Why did you do that?" I tried to answer, but my lips wouldn't form the words, my vision dimming at the edges. Outside, the gunfire still ripped through the night. Orders were being shouted, and the last thing I heard was a low whisper against my ear, carried on the scent of rain and expensive cologne. "Do not die for me. Do you hear? Do not die for me." Then, everything went black. I woke to the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne and the soft luxury of pressed sheets that felt like brushed velvet against my skin. A high, ornate white ceiling hovered above me, bathed in the warm, golden light spilling from a chandelier so gently that for a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. But the throbbing ache in my left shoulder dragged me back to reality with cruel clarity. I shifted slightly and bit down hard to stifle a cry. A firm, pristine white bandage wrapped my shoulder, meticulously placed. Everything in the room was eerily quiet. No beeping medical machines, no hurried footsteps of nurses, no sharp, antiseptic scent like the public hospital I had taken Lena to so many times. Instead, the air felt private, immaculate, almost foreign in its elegance. I lay on a bed far too large for any normal person's needs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, so high above that the buildings below looked like miniature models in a display case. A door opened and he stepped inside. Julian Rios, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his tie loosened at the collar, his expression stripped of its usual cool detachment, replaced by something more serious, harder to read. He stopped beside the bed, hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over me as if assessing damage. "You are awake." His voice was low, steady, laced with an underlying authority that no one would dare question. I turned toward him and instinctively tried to sit up, but a sharp bolt of pain made me hiss. "Do not," he said, taking a half step forward as if to help, before stopping himself, his eyes fixed on mine. "You will tear the stitches if you push yourself." I nodded, biting my lip. Lena, I gasped softly. Where is she? Safe, Julian replied, his voice firm. Mrs. Whitaker has been informed you were injured at work and need medical observation for a few days. Lena is being cared for. She is fine. I had no idea how he had obtained that information, but the fact that he knew my neighbor's name sent a shiver down my spine. How did you know? I started, but Julian cut me off with a look. I make it a habit to know the people who saved my life. Maya Brooks, 28, widow. Husband killed in a work accident 3 years ago. A 5-year-old daughter with type 1 diabetes. 2 jobs. Mornings at a daycare center. Evenings at Bellini's. 6 days a week. Income insufficient for expenses. He recited it as if reading from a dossier. Heat pricked at my eyes as I clutched the edge of the blanket. A knot of anger and humiliation twisting in my stomach. You dug through my life. I do not need your pity, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. Not pity, Julian answered, his gaze never wavering. Debt. You ran into gunfire for me with nothing to gain. You could have died. I cannot overlook that. I looked at him, my thoughts tangled and raw. I didn't do it for you. I just didn't want to watch someone die right in front of me, especially someone who clearly wasn't prepared to let go easily. Julian gave a slight nod, without arguing, murmuring almost to himself. No one deserves to be executed in a parking lot. His voice was low, as if thinking aloud, and the air between us seemed to settle into something heavy, charged with unspoken questions. I wondered if this was the first time he had been confronted with an action he couldn't predict or control. The room suddenly feeling too quiet until I broke the silence by saying I wanted to call Lena, that I needed to hear my daughter's voice. Julian pulled a small, brand new phone from his pocket, telling me it was activated, that I could call Mrs. Whitaker, that the number was saved, and that Lena was coloring pictures, completely unaware of what had happened. And when I took the phone with my right hand, my palm was still trembling as I asked how long he intended to keep me here, fighting off another wave of dizziness. He answered without hesitation, You will stay until I am certain no one can threaten you or your child. His words made me shake my head in weary disbelief because I couldn't stay here forever. I had work. I had a little girl who needed me. Julian stepped closer, his eyes sharpening as he said, Maya, you saved my life. You are not my employee. You are a mother who threw herself between me and a gunman. Which means that to the men who ordered the attack, you are now a threat. You are no longer invisible. His words chilled me so deeply that I looked out the window at the city glowing like a wide, golden tapestry and realized I had stepped into a world where I didn't belong. And the most frightening part was that there was no way back anymore. I didn't remember drifting to sleep, but when I opened my eyes again, the light outside had softened into a pale orange glow of sunset. The phone Julian had given me sat on the bedside table with the screen lit as if someone had just checked it. And when I touched it, a message appeared from an unknown number, though it wasn't difficult to guess who it was from, saying, Your daughter has had dinner. Slept well this afternoon. Everything is fine. I read that line again and again, as though it were the last fragile thread connecting me to the ordinary life I had just been torn away from. And then the door opened again, and this time it was a woman dressed in a light gray suit, her hair neatly pinned up, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. I sat up too quickly, forgetting the pain in my shoulder, as she greeted me calmly, saying, Hello, Miss Brooks. I am Diana Cruz, Mr. Rios's personal assistant, and I am here to discuss a few necessary matters regarding the coming days. Her voice was level and controlled, without a hint of warmth. Before I could respond, she placed a stack of documents on the small table, including a treatment plan, a list of medications, a schedule for physical therapy, and a confidentiality agreement, which made me frown as I asked if she expected me to sign it, careful not to jolt my injured shoulder. Diana nodded slightly, saying it was for my safety as well as the organization's, because I had witnessed something no one was meant to see, that I had saved the most powerful man in this city. And because of that, I needed to understand that my life would no longer be what it once was. I stared at the papers, feeling as though I were being swallowed by something far bigger than myself. I said I didn't want to be entangled in their world, that I just wanted to return to my daughter. But Diana sat across from me, legs crossed, hands folded on her lap, and said I had no choice, that the men who attacked Mr. Rios were not the type to give up, that they would come for me sooner or later, and when they did, no one but him could protect me. I gripped the blanket, furious and helpless, as I asked whether this was the cost of saving a life, whether I had become a hostage in his world. She adjusted her glasses and replied that I was not a hostage. I was someone whose debt Mr. Rios would never take lightly, and that was why I was alive, why my daughter was safe, and why I was lying in a luxurious room rather than a crumbling shack, waiting to die. I stayed silent, partly because she was right, and partly because I no longer knew how to respond when everything around me felt controlled by someone else, as if I had been wrapped inside a velvet-lined box that was beautiful but airtight, with no exit. When Diana rose to leave, she told me, "Mr. Rios will visit you tonight, and you should prepare yourself." After she closed the door, I remained clutching the edge of the sheets, realizing that Julian Rios owed me a life. But I was beginning to understand that in his world, debts were never simple, that nothing came without a price, that the rules were written in blood, silence, and unwavering loyalty. And the only question was how I was supposed to survive in a place I didn't belong. But before I could even think of an answer, the door opened again, and Julian entered without knocking, looking at me with eyes that no longer held cold distance, but a kind of tiredness, as though he too was wrestling with the gravity of what had happened. He asked if I knew what had surprised him most. When I shook my head, he stepped closer and said it was the fact that I wasn't afraid of him, that despite all the rumors and despite seeing the violence that surrounded him, I had still thrown myself in front of him, not because of who he was, but because he was human. I said nothing as he bent down and placed something on the bedside table, a small brown teddy bear with a pale blue ribbon, the one Lena had mentioned. He said he had arranged for it to be brought to me. When I picked it up, my fingers trembled at the familiar softness as I asked whether he had spoken to my daughter. He said only a little, that he had wanted to see whether the child of the woman who saved him had eyes like her mother. He paused, looking straight at me, saying she did, and that he realized the debt between us was far larger than he had first imagined. When daylight filtered in through the sheer cream curtains, spreading soft, golden streaks across the wooden floor, it almost made me think I was waking in some beautiful dream, until the ache in my shoulder, the tiny teddy bear Julian had brought from Lena, and the heavy pressure in my chest reminded me that this was reality. A reality wrapped in velvet and glass but filled with invisible rules I had not yet learned. As I stepped slowly out of the room, bare feet on cool wooden floors, my right hand steadying my injured shoulder, I found the space outside the bedroom transformed into something entirely different. With floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, expensive modern furnishings arranged with a precision that left no room for coincidence. Everything so deliberate it reminded me of its owner. A woman's voice floated from behind me, soft but unmistakably in control, asking whether I needed anything. "Miss Brooks?" When I turned, it was Diana, who was not asking out of concern but to ensure I wasn't stepping beyond any boundary. I said I only wanted to walk a little because the apartment was too quiet. She nodded slightly, motioning for me to sit on the long gray sofa as a server appeared almost instantly with a cup of herbal tea, not needing to ask because they already knew what I preferred. Diana sat across from me, still flawless, saying I had stepped into a system where everything functioned according to unwritten rules. Everyone was expected to understand. I met her gaze and told her to explain what I had become involved in. She nodded, saying, "Mr. Rios is not an ordinary businessman. He controls multiple economic sectors, both legitimate and unofficial, but he has principles: no trafficking, no drugs, no harm to innocent women or children." I let out a dry laugh, asking whether that made him a good man. She didn't blink as she answered, "No, but neither is he the villain you imagine. And above all, he always repays his debts. The golden law, a life for a life, a promise binding for as long as he breathes." I sat quietly, my eyes drifting to the abstract paintings on the walls, because this apartment looked like a modern paradise, But beneath the glass and warm light was a cold world where every choice carried consequences. Diana continued, "You have two options. To stay here under absolute protection, or to leave and place both your life and your daughter's in danger. Because the men who attacked that night won't vanish after a failed attempt. They will try again." I accused her of trying to frighten me. She said she was telling me the truth and that this was now the only safe place I had. I didn't answer because all I could picture was Lena sleeping in an unfamiliar room, clutching the teddy bear as her only anchor in a world that had suddenly grown too large. I knew I had to stay, at least until I was certain she was safe. Diana stood, adjusting her sleeve, saying, "Mr. Rios wishes to dine with you tonight," which made me blink in disbelief. "Dinner with me?" She simply nodded, adding that he was accustomed to obedience from everyone around him. But I was different because I had stood between life and death for a stranger, and that was something he could not take lightly. When she left, I remained seated, staring through the mist-softened skyline, a cup of cooling tea in one hand and the other gripping the edge of the table, sensing that whatever this dinner meant, after tonight, the line between Julian Rios and me would no longer be as simple as the boundary between the rescued and the rescuer, but something far more entangled, drawn together by rules etched in gold and glass, beautiful enough to chill the blood. I changed into the navy dress that had been hung in the closet for me, the cool, soft fabric gliding over my skin with such perfect precision that a shiver ran through me at the thought of someone choosing it according to my exact measurements. I tied my hair back and added a touch of soft color to my lips to hide the pallor left by days of exhaustion and pain. Not to be beautiful, but to hold on to the last sliver of control I had in a world I had never chosen to enter. When I stepped out of the room, Julian was already waiting by the tall window, his silhouette etched against the warm, golden glow of the city below, wearing only a white shirt with no jacket, no tie, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned wrists and the faint trace of a tattoo along his left arm, looking less like the man I had seen surrounded by gunmen and more like an oddly ordinary human being. He turned when he heard my footsteps and said, "You look better," his eyes moving quickly from my face to the bandaged wound on my shoulder, as I replied that it was surprising how surviving a bullet could give someone a radiant appearance, trying to lighten the tension. He gave a faint smile, the first I had ever seen on him, however brief, before saying dinner was ready and gesturing toward the table set in the center of the living space near the large window. A dark wooden table arranged simply but beautifully, candles flickering in the quiet room, with no guards, no staff, no one standing watch, just the two of us. When I sat down, I felt his gaze lingering. The dishes were already prepared before I arrived, kept perfectly warm beneath silver covers, though I barely remembered what I ate. Maybe seared salmon and a salad and warm bread. Everything delicious enough that I found myself swallowing quickly just to avoid meeting his eyes for too long while he barely touched his food, mostly watching me, lifting his glass only occasionally without looking away even for a moment until he finally spoke, saying he once believed he understood people, understood loyalty and betrayal, understood when someone was afraid and when they pretended to be brave, but that when I ran into the gunfire, he realized there were things about humanity he had never understood. I told him again that I didn't do it for him. I did it because I couldn't stand there and watch another person fall. He nodded, but said, "No one risks their life for a stranger unless they are different," his gaze burning into my skin until I had to look away because I didn't want to become something rare or exceptional to him. He had heard my pleas, my desperate desire for normalcy. I only wanted a quiet life, to nurture my daughter, work diligently, pay the relentless bills, and breathe to simply exist like any other ordinary soul. His response, however, was a steady, unwavering question, delivered with a voice that resonated with a deep understanding. Did I truly believe that an ordinary woman would find herself sharing a private dinner, here, in his personal sanctuary? And when I dared to ask if this opulent space was indeed his home, he offered a curt nod, elaborating that the entire top floor belonged solely to him. He had brought me here, he explained, because nowhere else offered sufficient security, nowhere else felt safe enough to entrust me. When I pressed further, inquiring about the reason for such extreme precautions, he revealed that I had unknowingly stepped into the very eye of a storm, a maelstrom of power and danger. He could not, in good conscience, abandon someone who had so selflessly saved his life. I drew a deep, fortifying breath, placed my fork deliberately on the table, and confronted him with the question that gnawed at me. What were his intentions for me? How long did he envision keeping me sequestered here? His answer was simple, direct, until every vestige of danger had passed. And when I challenged him with the hypothetical, asking what would happen if that danger never truly dissipated, he met my gaze, his eyes reflecting a profound and quiet gravity. He vowed to protect me, he said, at any cost. I hadn't known what answer I had been hoping to elicit. Perhaps a concrete plan, a tangible guarantee, something I could hold on to. Instead, I received a promise unburdened by negotiation. A straightforward vow from a man who wielded enough power to bring the entire city to its knees, yet somehow, inexplicably, felt compelled to protect an anonymous woman who had bled for him and walked away. As dinner drew to a close, he was the first to rise, offering a sincere thank you for my willingness to stay, remarking that not everyone would have possessed the courage to do so. I offered a silent nod, acknowledging his words. As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, a shadow silhouetted against the light. "Maya," he said, his voice laced with a hint of intrigue. "If you truly desire to know the real reason I am here, perhaps our next dinner will provide the opportune moment." With that enigmatic statement, he vanished down the hallway, leaving me alone in the dimming candlelight, my heart overflowing with a torrent of unanswered questions. Sleep eluded me that night. His final words replayed endlessly in my mind, an inescapable soundtrack. Asterisk, if you want to know the real reason I am here, perhaps the next dinner will be the right time. Asterisk, a sentence that carried no overt threat, no sweet invitation, only the distinct sense of a missing piece in a complex puzzle, a puzzle I was not yet permitted to fully assemble. I wandered through the vast, silent apartment, seeking something familiar, some semblance of an anchor in this alien world. The warm, golden glow of the lamps failed to dispel the coldness that was steadily growing in my chest as I stood before the wall of glass, gazing down at the sleeping city. The faint, scattered lights of distant windows reminded me poignantly of my old apartment, the humble space where Lena used to crawl into my bed whenever the rain fell hard against the window panes. Those memories now felt as distant and irretrievable as fragments of a past life. A small sound behind me startled me, causing me to whirl around sharply. Julian stood there, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, wearing a simple light gray sweater instead of his usual starched button-down shirt. He looked unexpectedly human. He offered a soft apology for startling me, admitting that sleep had also eluded him. I confessed that I was similarly afflicted. He stepped closer, until he stood beside me at the window, the city sprawling beneath us like a glittering tapestry. "The city is beautiful at night," he observed, his voice low. "But it is also the loneliest time." I couldn't decipher why he chose to confide that to me, and I offered no response. For a fleeting moment, we shared a quiet stillness, a fragile language of shared solitude. Before he spoke again, his voice tinged with a hint of introspection. "Have you ever wondered how a man like me," he began, "became the figure the entire city fears?" I glanced at him, the weight of countless rumors pressing down on me. Yet I had never heard the truth directly from his own lips. He revealed that his father had been Cuban, his mother Mexican. They had met in a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia. His father a skilled mechanic, his mother a talented seamstress. They lived a life of humble honesty, until a protection racket began to prey on his father's shop. When his father refused to succumb to their demands, 3 weeks later, he was discovered in a dark alley, beaten beyond recognition, dead. His mother, consumed by inconsolable grief, succumbed to a cancer 6 months later, a disease they could not afford to treat. He paused, his voice betraying no tremor, though I noticed his hand tighten slightly into a fist. He was only 14 years old, he continued, with no one to protect him, no one to stand beside him in the face of such devastating loss. He vowed then and there that he would never again allow anyone to take what he loved without exacting a heavy price. From that moment forward, he learned to navigate a world devoid of rules, ultimately forging his own. When he turned to face me, his eyes held not the cold darkness that the city whispered about, but a sorrow that had been frozen solid by years of relentless survival. He confessed that he was not a good man, but he had always drawn a line, never allowing women or children to be dragged into the morass of his Jala. I was the exception, he clarified, not because he desired it, but because I had made the conscious choice to stand beside him when I should have, logically, fled. I was at a loss for words. I could not claim to fully comprehend his experiences, nor could I readily forgive an entire system simply because he had once been a broken, orphan boy. Yet, I also could not deny the profound impact of seeing that behind the feared name whispered in hushed tones in restaurant hallways, there existed a human being, molded by unimaginable loss and twisted by a fierce loyalty born from unbearable injustice. I asked quietly, if he possessed the power to write his own rules, why he had chosen a path of violence. His answer was stark. Because sometimes, to survive, you cannot afford the luxury of gentleness. And sometimes, to protect what truly matters, you must become the very thing you once despised. I offered no argument, because deep down, I knew I, too, had been irrevocably changed by Lena's presence in my life. I had been forced to do things that the old version of myself would never have imagined, all in the name of keeping her safe and ensuring her smile. In that moment, I realized that we were not as different as I had initially believed. I was a mother desperately trying to hold onto a home, while he had been a son unable to save the home he loved, and so had built a cold fortress to endure. As he turned to leave once more, he paused, his voice softer now. He had never owed anyone anything as deeply as he owed me, he admitted. And what frightened him most was the gnawing fear that he might never be able to repay that debt in the right way. Then he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing before the vast expanse of glass, overwhelmed by conflicting thoughts about the man behind the power, and the quiet fear that I, too, was changing in ways I had not yet fully recognized. The next morning, I awoke in the unfamiliar room, still enveloped by the faint, comforting scent of clean fabric and aged oak. Sunlight filtered softly through the milk-white curtains, casting a gentle, golden wash across the ceiling. Everything looked peaceful enough to almost convince myself that the previous day had been nothing more than a vivid dream, until the dull ache in my shoulder served as a sharp reminder, along with the small teddy bear lying beside my pillow, and the cold, empty space within my chest where Lena belonged. I sat up abruptly, propelled by a sudden, urgent need to see her. I walked straight out of the room, heading towards what I instinctively knew was Julian's office. The door was unlocked. Julian stood with his back to me, his attention focused on a large screen mounted on the wall, which displayed security footage. On that screen, I saw Lena. She was sitting on the floor of a room overflowing with toys, drawings, and star-shaped pillows. Her hair was neatly tied into 2 small pigtails, adorned with pale blue ribbons. Her pink dress fanned out around her like that of a tiny princess. And I realized, with a surge of overwhelming relief, that she was not afraid at all. She was smiling, the purest, most genuine smile I had seen on her face since months of hospital visits and invasive procedures had stolen so much of her childhood joy. She clutched a crayon in her small hand and scribbled across a large sheet of paper, while beside her, Ms. Whitaker sat knitting, glancing over at Lena every now and then to ensure her well-being. Julian did not turn, but he knew I was there. He explained that he had ordered the room to be redesigned within 48 hours, remembering that I had referred to it as a castle during my phone call with Lena the night before, when I had promised her that someday, I would take her to live in a castle filled with colors, sunlight, and safety, a place free from needles and doctors, a promise I had secretly feared I could never fulfill. Julian finally turned towards me, his expression unreadable. He said that he could not replace my promise, but he could offer her something close to what she had imagined. I stepped closer, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. The room truly looked as though it had been plucked straight from the pages of a child's storybook. It was not luxurious in an adult sense, but rather in the way a child would create it, with vibrant crayons and boundless imagination. I whispered that I didn't know what to say, that he didn't owe me this. Julian frowned slightly. He owed me far more than that, he countered, but this wasn't about debt. This was because he knew all too well the devastating ache of losing a place to call home. And Lena, he said, needed a place like that. I nodded faintly, feeling something vast and profound shift within me. It wasn't confusion, nor was it anger anymore, but a gratitude so deep it frightened me. I asked if I could go to her, and Julian nodded, saying that a car would take me there today. He added that if I wished, my daughter could stay with me there for a few days. I turned to him, overwhelmed. He was offering me something I hadn't dared to hope for in years. Not money, not a house, but peace. A space not to hide, but to truly live. He left the room, leaving me alone with the image of my daughter drawing a sun in a deep yellow shade, humming a small, inaudible song. I reached out and touched the screen, tears streaming down my face before I could stop them. I realized that I still didn't know who Julian Rios truly was, beyond the whispered name that echoed across the city. But I knew one thing, that whatever he had done or was still doing that morning, he had done something right, and that mattered more to me than anything else in the world. The black car glided silently through the familiar streets, its dark-tinted windows blurring the view outside. Though each turn and curve lived in my memory like the lines of my own palm, because this was the road that had once led me home, everything had irrevocably changed. Lena sat beside me, clutching her teddy bear and her small pony-shaped backpack, saying little, only glancing up at me now and then, as if to reassure herself that I was still there, as if afraid that her mother might disappear. I stroked her hair and tried to force a smile, despite the knot of anxiety twisting inside me. Mrs. Whitaker followed behind in another car, having been arranged to stay in a temporary apartment within the same secure complex Julian had secured for Lena and me. And though he had handled everything with an almost unnerving thoroughness, it only tightened the unease in my chest. I knew all too well that when someone could control every detail, down to the smallest nuance, nothing truly belonged to you anymore. The car came to a stop in front of the old apartment building where Lena and I had lived for 3 years. A weary block of concrete with weather-stained windows and rusted stairs leading up to the second floor. I stepped out first, instructing Lena to stay inside the car with Mrs. Whitaker, and climbed the familiar steps to the door of the small unit that had once been our entire world. But the lock was new, not the one I had used. When I knocked 3 times, there was no answer. So I knocked harder. After a brief pause, a man opened the door. He was wearing a private security uniform, his face unfamiliar, his eyes detached and impersonal. I introduced myself, stating that this was my home, but he shook his head, explaining that the unit was no longer under my use, that the transfer had been processed, and that I should leave. I froze, demanding to know who had authorized such a thing, insisting that I had signed nothing and had not moved out. But he offered no explanation, simply closing the door in my face without apology. I stood there, stunned, in the dim hallway where Lena's footsteps had echoed every morning, where I had hung a paper lantern last Christmas, now erased as if none of it had ever existed. I walked back to the car, carefully concealing my devastation behind a calm facade. Lena looked up at me with hopeful eyes, asking if we were home yet. I swallowed my grief and nodded, telling her that we were on our way to her castle, that her new room was home now. She smiled and nodded, then turned to face the window. I watched her, my heart tightening. She was far too young to understand that some roads could never be retraced, no matter how desperately we wished it. As the car pulled away, I looked back one last time at the building that had once held our nights of feverish illness, whispered lullabies, and colored paper taped to the walls. It was now nothing more than a hollow shell, devoid of its soul. When we arrived at the complex Julian had assigned, Lena ran into her new room with a joy that broke my heart, touching every toy as if to memorize them, making sure they were real. I sat alone in the living room, staring out the window, knowing that Julian had been right. I no longer had any other choice. But that truth brought no comfort, only a growing emptiness in my chest, as though I had lost something worth more than walls or rent. Perhaps it was the right to choose, perhaps the illusion of freedom, or perhaps the sense that I was still living a life that belonged to me. Then, my phone chimed with a message from an unsaved number. A home is not a place, Maya. It is the person beside you. And the person you most want to protect is right now in the room next door. I looked towards Lena's slightly open door, where her nightlight cast a soft, honey gold glow. I didn't respond, but I knew Julian was watching, somehow. And for the first time, I didn't fear that. I only felt tired down to my bones. But within that exhaustion, a small part of me began to accept the truth, that the home I once knew no longer existed. And that the place I was living now, though not chosen by me, was the only place where I could begin again, for my daughter and perhaps one day for myself. The third morning in the new apartment began with the soft, bubbling laughter of Lena drifting out from the colorful room she had already begun calling her castle. I stood in the kitchen, stirring eggs in a gleaming induction pan, while the warm scent of coffee filled the air like a familiar note in a piece of music I had never heard before. Everything here was so perfect, so quiet, so convenient, that it felt as if I were living inside a glass box, polished every day. Yet some leftover instinct inside me kept tapping out a warning rhythm. The feeling that something was coming, vague, like the flicker of a figure in a mirror just before you turn around. Then, my phone vibrated with a message from Diana. Do not leave the apartment today. There is unrest in the Western District. Julian will handle it. You and Lena are protected. I read the message once. Then again, my heart beating faster. Unrest meant something was wrong. Meant someone was hurt. Meant gunfire, meant danger inching closer than safety could hold. I stepped out of the kitchen, checking the doors and windows before locking everything tight. Lena sat on the floor with her coloring book, asking if she could draw a princess with purple hair. I only nodded, unable to trust my voice to stay steady. I sat beside her and rested my hand gently on her back, as if to reassure myself that she was still here, still breathing, still whole. Sometime after 10, I heard a small sound at the door, faint but real, followed by 3 firm knocks. I rose immediately, signaling for Lena to stay in her room. Through the peephole, I saw a tall man dressed in black with no insignia. A stranger. I didn't open the door, but he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the crack, saying he was Tomas, one of Julian's men, and that they needed to take me somewhere safer. When I asked, my voice tight as piano wire, what had happened, he said they knew I was here, and they knew my daughter's name. I unlocked the door only enough to look him in the eye. I saw no lie there. I turned and lifted Lena into my arms, her face puzzled and half asleep, and we took the elevator down to the basement, where a black SUV waited with Diana inside, her expression calm, yet her white-knuckled grip on her phone betraying the stress beneath. I asked how they knew, and she paused before saying that they suspected someone inside their system had leaked information. That last night, a strange car had parked near the building, its plates belonging to a company that had gone bankrupt 5 years ago. When I asked if anyone had been hurt, she turned to me for the first time, showing the tiniest flicker of human weariness and fatigue as she said no. But they had left a message addressed to me. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope with slanted red ink, reading, "To the brave, foolish mother." I didn't open it because my hands were shaking too hard. Lena was now asleep in my lap, with the soft rise and fall of a child who knew nothing of what hunted us. As I looked at her and out the window, I understood we were not running anymore. We were being hunted. When we reached the safe house outside the city, I carried Lena inside and was shown into a room with bulletproof doors, stocked with supplies, clothes, food, and toys, enough for days. Before leaving, Diana spoke a sentence that made my heart plunge into some bottomless abyss, saying, "Maya, this time, it's not only about Julian. They want you and they will not stop." I nodded, gripping my hands tight, because there was no way back. No old home, no role of bystander left for me, because I had stepped onto the battlefield. And whether I wanted to or not, I would have to learn to survive it. Not just for myself, but for Lena, for the little girl with yellow hair and eyes that believed every promise I ever made. And because I could not let another person decide where my story ended, I woke in the middle of the night with a jolt of dread, as if something had brushed past my dreams. Lena was still sleeping in my arms under a thin blanket that felt like a fragile shield between us in a world quietly collapsing outside. Though the room was still, the air felt heavier. I sat up listening, finally hearing the alarm. Not a long, howling siren like in the movies, but a sharp, cold sequence of beeps slicing through the silence like a blade. I jumped to my feet, pulling Lena close, her eyes fluttering open as she sensed the terror in the rhythm of my heartbeat. Then the faint scent reached me. The smell of burning, melted plastic, and heated wood. The door burst open with Tomas standing there covered in dust and smoke, shouting that we had to go immediately, that the penthouse was on fire and the attack had come from outside. I didn't waste a second. My mother's instinct flooded every thought as I clutched Lena and ran after him down the hallway, lit by strobing red emergency lights. Another guard opened a rear hatch that led us into the underground bunker built beneath the house, where Diana stood with two others I didn't know, barking orders into a radio, her eyes cutting through the room like sharp steel. Though the bunker was secure, the smell of smoke still slipped in as a reminder that above us something was burning. I grabbed Diana's arm, asking which penthouse, whether it was Julian's. She nodded quickly, saying they had found his location, that someone inside might have been exposed. When I asked where he was, she said he was still in the building and refusing to leave because he wanted to secure documents. When I demanded to know what documents, she said she couldn't tell me, her eyes showing fear for the first time. I understood then that there were things larger than life at stake, and that Julian was still inside the apartment I had once called a glass cage, now a tomb if he didn't escape. Then a loud explosion shook the bunker, dust falling from the ceiling as Lena clung to me silently, with a strange knowing, as if she understood that this time, everything was different. Diana rushed to the control panel, watching a flashing red symbol disappear, as she whispered that the fire system on the top floor had been disabled. No more control. I let go of Lena and grabbed her arm, telling her to send someone in, that if Julian was alive, they had to pull him out immediately. She snapped that I didn't understand, because they weren't just burning the building. They were trying to drag him out through death, and if he died, everything collapsed. I saw then that she wasn't just a loyal assistant, but a woman ready to die with the system she served. But I was not. I couldn't let the man who saved Lena, who built her a castle, who looked at me as if I were not invisible, die for a document. I clenched my fists, saying if no one went, I would. Diana barked at me that I was out of my mind, but I had already turned back to Lena when Tomas grabbed my shoulders, saying they would send people, that it would not be me. I stared into his eyes as the screens flickered red, each second punching through me, until a smaller explosion blinked across the monitors, and the feed changed to show the rooftop, where Julian, covered in soot and ash, his shirt burned at the edges, was being carried out by two men. He never looked toward the camera, but I knew he was alive. Lena whispered, "Mommy, is he going to be okay?" I gathered her into my arms as tears fell onto her soft yellow hair, whispering that he would be fine. He would be fine. Though I knew the fire had not only consumed the penthouse, but had burned away the last barrier between me and Julian Rios's world. Because from that moment onward, I was no longer an observer, a mere bystander peering in from the periphery. No, I was now undeniably inside, irrevocably entangled in his orbit. And that inferno that had engulfed his penthouse? It was merely a prelude, a stark warning shot across the bow. Silence descended within the sterile confines of the emergency bunker. I instinctively pulled Lena closer, the weight of her small body a fragile anchor in the impending storm. As the final steel door groaned open, a hesitant sliver of light pierced the gloom, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke and the gritty residue of burned dust. Julian entered first, his gait unsteady, betraying the ordeal he'd just endured. Yet his eyes remained sharp, defiant, refusing to concede even a flicker of weakness. Soot streaked his face like war paint. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and a long, angry gash glistened along the right side of his cheek, a souvenir from shattered glass. But he was alive, and somehow, despite the grime and the wounds, he was still unmistakably the Julian Rios I knew, unyielding, relentless, dangerous in his quiet, calculating way. Without waiting for permission, I surged forward, propelled by a force I couldn't explain. He stopped, as if only then realizing I was there. For a long moment, his gaze locked with mine, a silent conversation passing between us. Then, the barest of nods, his hand resting briefly but firmly on my shoulder. He said nothing, yet his eyes spoke volumes. He had returned, yes, but the cost. The cost had been impossibly high. Diana followed, entering last. Her impeccable bun had come undone, strands of raven hair escaping to frame a face drained of color. Yet, her gaze remained as controlled and unwavering as ever. She announced, her voice clipped and urgent, that we needed to evacuate immediately. The safe house, she revealed, had been under surveillance for the past 24 hours, and the fire at the penthouse, the inferno that had nearly consumed us all, had been nothing more than a calculated distraction. My eyes remained fixed on Julian for another heartbeat before I signaled to Tomas to initiate the second escape route. There would be no vehicles above ground, no easy exit. I had never heard him issue orders before, but the moment his voice sliced through the room, the air crackled with a newfound tension, and everything shifted into motion. Tomas and the others, their faces grim, heaved open a steel hatch in the floor, revealing a narrow passage descending into the earth. Lena clung to me, her small fingers digging into my arm as I followed Julian down the cold metal steps. The smell of damp earth and ancient stone rose to meet us, a primal scent that sent a shiver down my spine. The tunnel was cramped and claustrophobic, the low ceiling punctuated by dim lights flickering against the rough-hewn rock walls. I didn't know where we were going, only that someone, long ago, had built this place with a singular, desperate intention. Survival. The echo of footsteps behind us mingled with the frantic pounding of my own heart, and with Lena's quickened breathing against my shoulder. After what felt like an eternity, more than 10 minutes of tense, hurried steps, we reached a small junction where Julian, with practiced ease, unlocked a heavy door with a code impossibly long. Beyond it lay a hidden room, a clandestine transfer station stocked with backpacks, water, flashlights, forged passports, and a meticulously detailed map. He pressed a small, folded piece of paper into my hand. His voice was low, urgent, filled with a weight I couldn't decipher. He told me that if he didn't make it out, I had to go on. Following the map, he explained, would lead to a vehicle waiting at the designated rendezvous point, a vehicle that would carry Lena and me out of the city, all the way to New Hampshire. I shook my head, gripping the paper as if it were a lifeline. He would not stay behind, I insisted. He couldn't. He looked at me then, his gaze holding a silence that stretched like an entire century. He said he wasn't planning on leaving us, but if something happened, he needed me to live. He needed Lena to live. As I looked at him, standing there amidst the chaos and the uncertainty, it felt as if the world were spinning around me while I remained rooted to the spot. I told him I wasn't the strong woman he seemed to believe I was, only a mother desperately trying to shield her child from harm. He lifted his hand then, his touch surprisingly gentle as he brushed away a smear of ash from my cheek. He said he was a man willing to burn an entire city to the ground to keep the two of us alive. That people like us, people forced to the fringes, had no choice except to move forward. Diana appeared at the doorway, her face etched with urgency. The intruders, she warned, had reached the lower levels. Time was running out. Julian barked out orders, directing everyone ahead, saying he would cover our retreat. I wanted to protest, to argue, but one look at his face silenced me. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of changing his mind. I gathered Lena close, and with a silent prayer, ran with the others down the final corridor, each step echoing with 1,000 unspoken questions, 1,000 words left unsaid. Behind us came the metallic crash of weapons, the heavy stomp of boots on concrete, the relentless sound of a storm closing in. When we reached the last exit, the sky opened before us like a miracle, a vast expanse of dark velvet pierced by a sliver of hope. A black SUV idled in the shadows, its engine humming like the determined heartbeat of someone refusing to die. I turned back toward the tunnel, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Julian still hadn't appeared, but I couldn't go back. Lena was in my arms, her life, her future, resting entirely on my shoulders. Survival demanded forward motion. As the heavy door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the sounds of the battle, I was consumed by a paralyzing uncertainty. Had I just lost him forever? Or had I saved him in the only way available to me? The vehicle surged forward, spitting gravel as it sped into the night, leaving behind a burning corner of the city and a shattering piece of my own heart. By the time we reached a small town on the outskirts of New Hampshire, dawn was tentatively lifting itself over the treetops, its pale light seeping through the cracked window, carrying with it the crisp breath of early winter. The scent of pine and cold mist filled the air, easing the painful tightness in my chest. After days drenched in the smoke and gunfire of a city filled with names I barely understood, yet had already learned to fear, the quiet stillness of the countryside felt surreal. Lena slept in my lap, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Her small hand gripped my sweater tightly, as if afraid I might vanish if she loosened her hold. The SUV slowed, then stopped before a two-story wooden house nestled deep among the trees, its moss-covered roof and lace-curtained windows lending it the soft, faded charm of a forgotten postcard. The old porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. A woman stood waiting, small in stature, with silver-streaked hair pinned neatly at her nape. Her eyes, sharp yet undeniably kind, took in both me and the sleeping child in my arms. I recognized her instantly, Olivia. Her name was scrawled on Julian's note, a beacon of hope in a sea of uncertainty. She stepped closer, studying Lena with a gentle gaze before saying, her voice quiet but firm, that the child would be safe here, and that I would be too, at least for the moment. I nodded, managing a weak smile, though my heart struggled to believe that anything in my life could ever truly be quiet again. Olivia led us inside, where the warm, comforting scent of toasted bread and hot tea enveloped us like a tender embrace. She brought us to the attic room, where a window looked out over a vast valley of pines. The bed was covered in a thick wool blanket, a comforting invitation to rest. Children's books were lined up neatly on a small shelf, their colorful spines a silent promise of normalcy. And above the headboard hung an old painting of the sea, its turbulent waves a stark contrast to the tranquility of the room. I didn't ask Olivia about her past, but that night, after Lena had finally fallen asleep, and I sat drinking tea with her in the warm glow of the living room, she began to speak without any prompting. She told me she had once been an army nurse, and that she had met Julian when he was just 18 years old during a relief program at the southern border. He had been different from the other boys, she said, quiet, observant, fiercely protective of anyone weaker than himself. And that one day he had carried in a gravely injured child, wounded by a homemade explosive, a child no one else dared to touch. Julian had bandaged the wounds with steady hands and walked 10 kilometers with the child on his back, waiting patiently outside the clinic for 6 hours. When she asked him why he had done it, he simply said, because no one else would. Olivia paused, her gaze drifting into the past, into memories of the boy he once was. Then, she told me how she had later moved east to open a private clinic for immigrant families, a place Julian protected fiercely, sending people to guard it so no one could threaten it. He believed in no government, she explained, yet kept his promises with unwavering loyalty, surviving by a mixture of ruthlessness toward his enemies and unwavering devotion to those he trusted. I asked if she trusted him. Olivia looked at me, her eyes as deep and knowing as an old well, saying she did, though she wasn't blind to his flaws. She knew Julian had done things she could never forgive. Yet, she also knew that if he ever had a chance to save himself, that chance was me. I fell silent, unsure what to feel. I was no savior, only a mother who had acted on instinct, a fleeting moment of bravery born from desperation. But perhaps that instant, that single act of defiance, had somehow shifted the path of a man who seemed immovable. Olivia rose to pour more tea, then sat again, her voice low and serious. Julian, she said, wouldn't stop until the person behind the attack was erased. But that I needed to prepare myself. The enemy didn't only want him, they wanted me. I was no longer an invisible woman. I watched the fire dancing in the hearth, knowing she was right, I was no longer afraid of that truth. Lena remained the reason I stayed alive, the center of my world. But Julian, in some unspoken, undeniable way, had become the reason I was ready to fight. I didn't know what future awaited us, what trials lay ahead. But that night, in the warm wooden house tucked deep in the embrace of the forest, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no turning back now, and I no longer wished to. 2 days later, Julian appeared at the door of the wooden house before the sun had even thought to peek over the treeline. I heard the vehicle stop a distance away, its approach cautious and deliberate. Then, the familiar weight of footsteps crossing the weathered porch boards, the sound sending a jolt of electricity through my veins. 3 short knocks followed by one long one echoed. Lena was still asleep, nestled in the safety of her dreams, while Olivia was making tea in the kitchen, her presence a comforting reassurance. And when I opened the door, my heartbeat thundered with the same frantic rhythm it had the first time I watched him walk out of the smoke and ruin of the burning penthouse. Julian looked different, not because of the injuries that had been carefully and expertly tended, but because of his eyes. Something deeper resided there now, something heavier, as if the past days had stripped away the last mask he had ever worn. He said nothing when I opened the door, only looked at me in a long, quiet moment, a silent assessment passing between us, before stepping inside when I gave the barest of nods. Olivia set out 2 cups of tea and slipped away, leaving just the 2 of us with the soft crackle of the fire filling the silence. He sat across from me, his fingers laced together, his eyes never leaving mine for even a second. He said he should begin with an apology for pulling me and Lena into all of this. But I shook my head, cutting him off. Even if I hadn't stepped in front of the bullet that day, he would still have been hunted, the target of a relentless enemy. Lena and I explained, were merely 2 pieces that happened to fall onto a chessboard that had been arranged long before we stumbled into it. Julian offered a faint smile, not of amusement, but of reluctant acknowledgement. Then, he reached into his pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table between us. When I asked what was inside, he simply said, his voice devoid of emotion, that it was an opportunity. I opened it, my fingers trembling slightly, to find documents tucked neatly inside. New passports, new identification cards, a new birth certificate for Lena, all bearing entirely new names, along with plane tickets, the address of a house in Portugal, and information about a bank account that had already been opened. I looked up at him, shock widening my eyes. Was he planning to send us away? Julian nodded, his gaze unwavering. If I agreed, he could have Lena and me out of the United States within 24 hours. Everything had been meticulously arranged, he assured me. No one would be able to trace us. The house would be mine, he said, and no one would ever reach for us again. I held the packet in my hands, my heart pounding so hard I felt as if it might tear itself free from my chest. A part of me, a desperate, weary part, wanted to nod immediately, wanted to grab Lena and vanish from the war closing in around us, wanted to live quietly, without flinching at every unfamiliar sound outside a door. But another part, a part one hadn't realized had grown so strong, so defiant, didn't want to leave. I placed the papers back on the table, my voice barely a whisper. Why was he doing this? Why wasn't he trying to keep me? He had the power to do so. Julian looked at me then, with a kind of rare sincerity I had never seen in him before. He said he didn't keep the people he cared about by caging them. He had once lost everything, he said, and knew the shame, the crippling guilt, of someone suffering because of him. He didn't want that for me. I drew a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I reminded him of what he had once told me, that some debts could not be repaid with money. What did that mean for my debt to him? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze averted. Then he looked up, his eyes searching mine. If he told me I owed him nothing, would I believe it? When I shook my head, I realized with a jolt of clarity that I didn't want to believe it. Perhaps because I no longer wanted to leave. I told him that if I ran now, I would spend the rest of my life running, looking over my shoulder, always afraid. And Lena would grow up with a mother who taught her to fear the world. I couldn't live that way. He looked at me for a long time, a silent battle raging within him. Then he nodded, a subtle movement that spoke volumes, as though he had already known my answer, but still needed to hear it from my own mouth. He said that if I stayed, I would no longer stand on the edges. I would be fully inside, irrevocably committed. I nodded, telling him I understood. I was ready. Lena was the reason I lived. But he was becoming the reason I no longer feared living. Julian bowed his head, his hands tightening into fists. When he looked up, I saw in his eyes a promise that needed no words, no signature. A silent vow that from this moment on, he would not leave me to face anything alone. By choosing not to flee that morning, I stepped another shade deeper into his world. A world where safety was a forgotten luxury, but truth and feeling had never been sharper, never been more real. Our second dinner didn't take place in a luxurious apartment with expensive wine or crisp white linens or candlelight glinting off crystal. It happened in Olivia's warm wooden kitchen, filled with the comforting aroma of stew that had been simmering since morning and toasted bread still warm to the touch. Lena sat at the table, her mouth full of soup and a smear of tomato sauce on her cheek, animatedly telling Julian about the singing doll Olivia had found in the attic. Julian simply listened, his gaze softening as he watched her, sometimes nodding, even wincing once when she asked whether he was afraid of needles. The air was so light, so filled with an unexpected normalcy, that I nearly forgot that the man sitting across from me was a name whispered with fear throughout the city. A phantom, a force to be reckoned with. When dinner ended, Olivia took Lena upstairs, leaving Julian and me alone at the table, mostly cleared except for 2 steaming cups of tea and the soft glow of the old lamp overhead. I rested my hand on the table, quiet for a long moment, gathering my thoughts. Then, I asked him to tell me the real reason everything had begun. Why had I been pulled into this? Why had Lena nearly died in a war I had never even known existed? Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes lowering toward his cup. And for the first time, I saw him without that absolute impenetrable control, without the mask of invincibility he always wore. When he finally looked at me, his voice carried a weight I never imagined hearing from him. He told me the man behind the attack was Victor Lang, once an ally, now a traitor, a cancer eating away at everything he had built. A man whose name I had heard whispered by customers at the restaurant, a weapons trafficker with charities used as fronts, and a network filthier than any local government. Julian said Victor had once worked for him. He had helped Victor launder money in exchange for information and power, a necessary evil in a world where survival demanded compromise. But Victor wanted more. He wanted Julian. He wanted his entire system, his influence, his empire. And when Julian refused, Victor began systematically breaking it from the inside, tearing down everything he had worked for. One of Victor's men, a viper disguised as a friend, had infiltrated Julian's inner circle and had leaked Lena's medical records. And I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, realizing that the documents I had believed were safely locked away, the intimate details of my daughter's illness, the diagnoses, the treatments, the entire hospital history of my child, had been delivered into the hands of men who didn't even know her name, men who saw her as nothing more than leverage, a pawn in a deadly game. Julian said Victor used those records as leverage, believing Julian would kneel when a child was pushed toward the brink of death. But Julian had not. He lifted his eyes, and they looked like cooled ash, devoid of all warmth, all emotion. He told me he had once believed he could control everything if he were ruthless and clever enough, that the world would hold still beneath his feet, bending to his will. And then I appeared, not as a threat, but as a shard of glass slamming into the wall he had spent years constructing, shattering his carefully crafted illusions. I listened, mesmerized, as though each word peeled back layers I once thought impenetrable, revealing the raw, vulnerable core beneath the carefully constructed facade. He told me I wasn't the first Victor had targeted, but I was the first to stand in his way. And I had done it with no weapon, no power, only a foolish decision made in the rain, a single act of compassion that had changed everything. When he asked what I thought he was, I told him I once believed he was a monster in a suit, a creature devoid of empathy. But now I believed he was a man trying to become something better, struggling against the darkness within himself. He didn't deny it, saying I was not just a single mother, but the reason he was sitting there, the reason he hadn't succumbed to the darkness. Not because of any debt, but because I made him want to end this war once and for all, to eradicate the evil that threatened to consume us all. My hands tightened around the warm cup, the ceramic offering a small measure of comfort in the face of such brutal honesty. I told him that if he was going to finish this, if he was truly committed to ending the cycle of violence, I wanted to know. I wanted to be a part of it. He shook his head, his jaw clenched, saying I had a daughter to protect. I told him I understood. I had once had a family, too, and knew that once you were dragged into something like this, silence was no longer an option. I no longer wanted the seat in the back, the illusion of safety. I wanted to fight. Julian looked at me for a long time, searching my eyes, assessing my resolve. Then, finally, he nodded, a subtle movement that sealed our fate. We would need a plan, he said. He would show me the real face of Victor Lang, the monster beneath the mask. And together we would make sure he could never touch anyone again. And in the quiet light of that wooden kitchen, with the sound of insects drifting in from the forest and the faint taste of tea lingering on my lips, I realized that the second dinner was not just a meal, not just a friendly gathering. It was the true beginning. And for the first time, in a world built on lies and violence, I was hearing a truth that did not hide, a truth that resonated with a newfound strength within my own soul. The next morning, when I woke, Julian was already in the kitchen with Olivia. His dress shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing the hard muscles of his forearms, as he clumsily chopped carrots, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lena stood beside him, giving stern instructions as if she were the head chef, her tiny voice filled with an authority that was both endearing and absurd. The sight of them, standing there together, bathed in the warm morning light, made me pause at the doorway for a few seconds, not out of surprise, but because an unexpected wave of tenderness washed over me, a feeling I had once believed I no longer had the right to feel. We ate breakfast together, a simple meal of eggs and toast, and no one mentioned Victor Lang or the burns still carved into my memory. But when Lena and Olivia went upstairs, their laughter echoing through the house, Julian turned to me with the familiar seriousness in his eyes and said he would take me somewhere, offering no explanation beyond a small nod and a reminder to bring a coat. We drove for hours, along winding mountain roads that twisted and turned deeper into the northern woods, where phone signals faded into nothing and the world seemed to shrink around us. When the vehicle finally stopped, a small wooden cabin rested in the valley ahead, its roof covered in dry leaves, its walls aged and moss-stained, as though untouched for years, a relic of a forgotten past. Julian opened the door, and a damp, musty smell drifted out, not unpleasant, but like an old memory unsealed after too long. He led me down a narrow hallway into a room filled with maps, files, and photographs, all of them focused on a single subject, Victor Lang. One entire wall was covered with images, notes, and connecting lines, a sprawling web of information meticulously gathered over years of relentless pursuit. And at the center of it all was a picture of a boy around 12 years old standing beside a woman in medical scrubs. I recognized Olivia, her face younger, but her eyes holding the same unwavering compassion. The boy beside her was Julian. "This is where I began," he said, his voice deep and worn, like the ancient beams of the old cabin, a place that held the secrets of his past. After his mother died, he explained, he lived here with his foster father, a former police officer forced out for being too honest with his superiors, a man who had taught him to read people, read danger, and above all, survive, until he was murdered for exposing a politician tied to human trafficking. And from that day on, Julian had trusted no one but himself, relying on his own instincts, his own abilities, his own unwavering determination. He stepped closer to the board, his fingers brushing against a photo of a silver-haired man with cold, dead eyes. Victor Lang, he said, was the first to pull him into the underworld, the man who had given him money and power and waited patiently for the day he would return payment with his soul. And when Julian refused to keep washing Victor's blood, refused to become another puppet in his twisted game, Victor chose another path, tearing down everything Julian had built and destroying anyone he cared about. including me and Lena. I stepped closer, studying every photo and note Julian had spent years gathering, and I understood why he couldn't back away, why this was more than just a war. It was a personal vendetta, a reckoning with his own past. And I understood why I could no longer stand apart either. I was no longer just an innocent bystander. I was a target, a pawn, a part of this twisted game whether I liked it or not. But amid all that ugliness, all the betrayal and violence, one question kept circling in my mind, nagging at my conscience. I asked him softly but firmly what the line was between him and Victor, between what he had done and what Victor was doing. How could I know he wouldn't someday become the very thing he despised? How could I be sure he wouldn't cross that line? Julian looked at me for a long time, his gaze unwavering, not flinching, not defending himself. "Because I have you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Without you, I wouldn't ask myself that question every day. Without you, I would have no reason to distinguish between surviving and doing what is right. You are my line, Maya." I clenched my hands, feeling the cold of the wooden floor through my shoes, the chill seeping into my bones. I didn't want to be anyone's moral boundary, I said, or the reason someone lived better. If I chose to stand with him, it must not be from guilt or debt, but because I believed in him, because I believed in the man he was trying to become. Julian stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze softening. He told me not to believe his words, but to look at how he protected me and Lena, to look at what he was about to do to end this, to see the lengths he was willing to go to keep us safe. And that if I ever saw him cross that line, if I ever saw him succumbing to the darkness, I should be the first to stop him. He swore he would listen. In the silence of the forest cabin, surrounded by the blood-stained past and the uncertain future, I didn't answer aloud, but I remained where I was instead of turning away, instead of running. And perhaps that was the answer, the only answer I needed to give. When we returned from the cabin, the sky had darkened with gray clouds, and the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves clung to the air like a warning, a subtle threat carried on the wind. Olivia stood on the porch, her silhouette framed against the fading light, holding a small piece of paper in her hands. Her expression was unchanged, her features as composed as ever, but her eyes were heavy with worry. Someone had left it at the door with no sound, no tracks, no indication of who had been there. Julian unfolded it, his jaw tightening as he read the messy, red-inked scrawl. "This time we will not only burn the house." He crushed the paper instinctively, his hand clenching into a fist. And my heart, which had begun to beat with a tentative hope, plummeted once more into the depths of fear. The phone slipped from my grasp as the truth crashed down. The safety I thought I had found was a mere illusion. Victor Lang had finally cornered us, emerging from the shadows to claim his prize. That evening, Julian made the calls. Tomas and Diana arrived swiftly, transforming the house into a hive of activity. Footsteps echoed through the halls, hurried voices filled the air, and communication equipment hummed with a nervous energy. Maps were spread across the dining table, each marked with red ink, resembling open wounds bleeding across the landscape. Olivia quietly slipped away, taking Lena to the home of vetted neighbors, people we could trust with her life. While Julian and I huddled in the living room, now a makeshift operations center, Diana's voice crackled over the comms, reporting remotely that a hired armed group, while officially unlinked to Victor, was mirroring our every move and closing in on the town. They could be here within 12 hours. Julian, his face a mask of grim determination, didn't flinch. "We don't have time to wait," he stated, his voice a low, steely command. "Lena has to be moved immediately." Panic clawed at my throat. "She'll panic if we separate her again," I protested, my voice laced with desperation. Julian's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me. "These men won't hesitate to fire," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I won't risk Lena in this war." His words struck like a physical blow. I knew he was right. Logic screamed it, but my heart refused to listen. He unfurled another map, revealing a hidden escape route, an underground tunnel snaking from the house to an abandoned barn nearly 2 miles away. He explained that Tomas would meet Olivia and Lena with a vehicle at the far end, whisking them away to a secure safe house in Vermont, a place where they would have the option to disappear from the country altogether if necessary. Helplessness tightened my fists. "What about you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What will you do?" Instead of a direct answer, Julian offered a ghost of a smile, a sad, knowing curve of his lips. "I'll stay," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "I have no choice. This is my war." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "But this time, I'm not fighting to protect an empire. I'm fighting to keep you alive." His voice resonated with a raw, unvarnished truth, a depth of emotion that no strategic calculation could mask. I nodded, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between us. Time was slipping through our fingers like sand. I found Lena in her room, her eyes wide and filled with a growing dread. "Are we leaving again?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. I knelt beside her, wrapping my arms around her frail shoulders, drawing her close. "It's just for a few days, sweetheart," I whispered, forcing a reassuring tone. "I promise, I'll come for you soon." She nodded, her lower lip quivering. I kissed her forehead, inhaling the innocent, childlike scent of her shampoo, and something deep inside me shattered. That night, under the veil of whispering rain, Lena and Olivia descended into the dark mouth of the tunnel. Diana, ever vigilant, inspected each step, ensuring their safety. Tomas led the way, his silhouette disappearing into the inky blackness. Julian and I stood on the porch, watching distant lights flicker like predatory eyes in the dark, swallowing the fear threatening to paralyze us. "What are our chances?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the rain. Without a flicker of hesitation, he answered, "Without you, they have 60%. With you here." He trailed off, his voice thick with unspoken fear. I don't dare calculate it. I turned to him, searching his face. He wore a faint smile, laced with both teasing affection and a painful honesty. A laugh, sharp and desperate, escaped my lips, rising into the wet night like the last weapon we had against the encroaching darkness. "Then what are you waiting for?" I challenged. "Begin." Julian nodded, his gaze hardening. He drew his pistol from his coat, checking the rounds with practiced ease. No longer the phantom haunting skyscraper shadows, he was now a man standing in front of his own doorway, preparing to face a former friend turned monster. I stepped back inside, my heart pounding against my ribs. I lifted the radio, listening intently as Tomas confirmed their safe arrival at the transfer point. Lena was far away now, hopefully safe from harm. It was just us, the house, and the approaching footsteps growing closer by the minute. The war had reached our doorstep, and this time, I was not stepping back. Night rain drummed against the roof like a slow countdown. Each minute stretched thin inside the dimly lit room as the quiet tension between Julian and me settled into the walls like breath held too long. He remained by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees where the hired men would soon appear, while Diana stayed in the basement checking the communication lines. I stood at the table, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the folder Julian had left on the wooden surface. Inside was everything we had on Victor Lang. Swiss bank accounts, meticulously documented records of bribed officials, irrefutable proof of his connections to an international trafficking network. If this information reached the press, it would cripple a portion of his empire, but not enough to bring him down completely. He was a master of evasion, adept at slipping past the scrutiny of the media. He had buried countless victims beneath mountains of nameless paperwork. I understood then that if we truly wanted to destroy him, we couldn't strike from afar. We had to get close, and I was the one person he hadn't prepared for. I turned to Julian, my mind already made up. "Let me go." Julian looked at me, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Go where?" "Into his center. He wants me to be your weakness. Let me be his blind spot. I will go to him, bring a copy of the files, lure him in. If I succeed, he will reveal himself. If I fail, at least I drag him away from here." Julian stepped forward, gripping my shoulders, his eyes as deep and intense as the night itself. You think this is a film, Maya? You think he will let you live once you walk in? You are a mother. You are the reason we are still standing. I placed my hand over his, tightening my grip. And because I am a mother, I know what sacrifices matter. And because I am the woman who loves you, I cannot stand back while you fall. Not when I still have a chance to do something. Julian froze, my words cutting through his carefully constructed armor like a bullet, forcing every defense he had to crack. A long, heavy silence hung between us, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly. If you go, Tomas goes with you. I will not let you face him alone. But Maya, he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion, you must promise to pull back when necessary. Do nothing unless you have my signal. I nodded, my resolve hardening. From this moment on, I am the Maya he does not know. I changed clothes, leaving behind anything that could identify me, and carefully concealed an encrypted copy of the USB drive, containing information powerful enough to topple an entire system. Diana handed me a small earpiece, hidden in the button of my shirt, her voice steady as early morning fog. You have 3 hours, she said. After that, everything shifts to plan B. I walked to the car with Tomas as the rain intensified, the road slick and treacherous, as if glazed in ice. The car shuddered to a halt at an abandoned warehouse, a transit point Victor used for his illicit shipments. No visible guards, no obvious traps, but I knew the silence itself was the most dangerous trap of all. We stepped inside, the air thick with the stench of decay and fear. Tomas's voice crackled in my ear. All channels open. We are 2 minutes away. One call from reaching you. A single weak yellow bulb flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Victor Lang stood in the center, a long coat draped over his shoulders, a glass of amber liquor swirling in his hand, as though he were greeting an expected, albeit unwelcome, guest. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. You are the one I cannot predict. That is why I agreed to meet. I walked closer, each step measured, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I bring an offer, I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. My life in exchange for Julian's permanent silence. He raised a brow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, and chuckled softly. Your life holds what value? I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and held it aloft. If I do not return in 3 hours, this will be released. All of it. Every dollar. Every secret you buried. He went still, his gaze hardening as he studied me, calculating, deciding whether to kill me where I stood. And in that instant, I knew I had stumbled upon the only crack in his carefully constructed armor. I, a mother, an outsider, had accomplished what Julian's entire world could not. I had made Victor Lang hesitate. And sometimes, hesitation is the beginning of a collapse. Victor remained motionless, his stare slicing through me as if searching for something he hadn't yet named. The glass remained in his hand, untouched, the lone bulb casting a pale shimmer across the thick gold ring on his left middle finger. At last, he set the glass down on a nearby crate and took one slow, deliberate step toward me, unhurried, as if he still truly believed he held every thread of control. You know, Maya, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I once believed Julian was unshakable. The way he watched a man tortured without blinking. The way he ordered the disposal of a former friend for a single act of betrayal convinced me he was the only one who could build the final empire with me. Then you arrived, and he began to hesitate. He began to choose loyalty. He began to grow weak. I said nothing, gripping the USB drive as if it were the last piece of my life. I did not come to speak about Julian, I said, my voice unwavering. I came to offer you a choice. You disappear, withdraw from everything, bury your name forever, and let me live, or you kill me, knowing this will reach every major media channel within 10 minutes of my signal cutting off. Victor laughed, but the sound was devoid of warmth, laced with a chilling undercurrent of menace. You think I haven't faced ultimatums? He asked, his eyes glinting like shards of ice. I have lived my life in rooms without windows, Maya. But no one has ever placed truth on the table the way you just did. I knew I was gambling, not with a sure card, but with the only card I had myself, and the desperate hope that even a man like Victor Lang feared losing one thing above all else: control. He circled me like a cat studying a cornered mouse, his movements fluid and predatory. You love him, don't you? He asked, his voice soft as breath but sharp as a blade. I turned to meet his stare, refusing to flinch. Yes, I said, my voice ringing with conviction. And that is why I am willing to die if it means he lives. Silence fell heavy, thick as a curtain, suffocating and oppressive. Victor stopped behind me, close enough that I could feel his breath cold and steady on the back of my neck. Then, instead of giving an order, instead of summoning the violence I knew he was capable of, he returned to the table, lifted the glass, and drank it empty. Go, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. And tell Julian this is the last time I forgive a debt without a ledger. Next time I will collect in blood. I didn't wait another second. I turned and stepped out of the warehouse, my legs moving with a speed born of adrenaline and fear, even as my heart refused to believe I had just walked away alive. Tomas stood beside the vehicle, tension etched into his face. I simply nodded, offering no explanation. Nothing more needed to be said. As the car sped down the forest road, I finally loosened my grip on the USB drive and exhaled, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, like someone breaking the surface after a breath held too long. When we reached the house, Julian was waiting on the porch, rain soaking him through as if he hadn't moved from that spot for hours. I ran to him, saying nothing, only wrapping my arms around him and feeling the urgent, frantic beat of his heart against mine. I did it, I whispered, my voice trembling with exhaustion and relief. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something break open in Julian's eyes. Not fear, not anger, but pure, unadulterated relief. You could have died, he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. But I didn't, I countered, pulling back slightly to look at him. I came back. I chose to come back. I stepped away, placing my hand on his cheek, feeling the rough stubble against my palm. I am not a debt, Julian. I am a choice. And today I chose you, not out of obligation, not from fear, but because I believe that after all the shadows, there is still a part of you that knows how to hold on to what is right. And for the first time, Julian didn't answer with words. He only held me, his arms locked tight around me, as if in that single moment, he finally allowed himself to believe he was someone worth saving. 1 week after I walked out of that warehouse with my life still intact, the name Victor Lang was splashed across every television screen in America as he was arrested at a private airport, not even 20 minutes from New York City. The news spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path, as major networks reported the same headline: underground financial kingpin charged with more than 23 counts, from money laundering and human trafficking to collusion with terrorist organizations. His image, handcuffed, his face cold and unreadable, flashed across countless screens, the visual symbol of a toppled empire. But what no one else knew was that the FBI hadn't brought him down. No specialized task force had reopened old files or meticulously dug into his financial web. It was Julian who sent the encrypted dossier to 2 of Victor's former allies, along with a simple, chilling message: cooperate or go down with him. They chose survival, and the rest fell like a string of dominoes, collapsing faster than anyone could have predicted. I stood beside Julian in Olivia's warm, inviting living room. The television silently rolled a final headline: "The Lang Empire has officially fallen." Julian said nothing, his expression impassive, but I noticed the faint twitch in his fingers, a reaction too instinctive to hide. I knew this wasn't merely victory for him. It was the end of a life he had lived for so long that he no longer knew who he was without it. I stepped closer and rested my hand on his shoulder, offering silent comfort. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen as he said, his voice low and almost mournful: "He was someone I trusted once. I thought if anyone understood how this world worked, it was him. And then, day by day, I realized he wasn't navigating the world. He was devouring it. I nodded gently, tightening my hold on him. Then what about you, Julian? When the monster is gone, what does that make you? He turned toward me, and the sharpness in his eyes had softened, deepened, become human again. I think I want to learn how to be a person again, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Maybe not a perfect one, but at least one who doesn't need to kill to survive. We didn't celebrate. No champagne popped. No triumphant phone calls were made, because what had been lost could never be counted. Lives broken, memories twisted, wounds no one could see, but that ran deep nonetheless. The next day, Julian drove me and Lena away from the cabin, no longer in fear or haste. We followed the winding road through the forest, the car moving slowly as if reluctant to leave the quiet behind. Lena slept peacefully in the back seat, clutching the singing doll Olivia had given her. I sat beside Julian, feeling a strange, almost fragile lightness. Not because everything was suddenly good, but because for the first time the road ahead looked like a road, not a cliff. Julian stopped the car at a ridge overlooking a valley, a breathtaking panorama of rolling hills and shimmering trees. He turned off the engine and stepped outside, inhaling deeply, filling his lungs with the fresh, clean air. I followed him, drawn by an invisible force. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry grass, a refreshing balm to our weary souls. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small memory card, containing the final copy of everything we had on Victor Lang. Then he placed a lighter in my palm. "Burn it," he said, his voice firm. I looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of doubt. "Are you sure?" He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "No one needs to remember this anymore. Not because we are hiding from it, but because we deserve a beginning not dragged down by shadows." I flicked the lighter and touched the flame to the edge of the card. The plastic curled and blackened, releasing a pungent smell as it consumed the data within. The tiny red embers fell to the ground, before the wind swept them away, scattering them like fallen stars. When I looked back at Julian, he stood quiet, his silhouette framed against the vast expanse of the sky. No longer a ruler, no longer a man burdened by the world he once held up, just a man learning to love, to release, and to start again. And I knew then that we didn't need a perfect beginning. We only needed each other and a path to keep walking. Every debt had been paid. Every choice had been made. And Victor Lang, whose name once shook the entire underworld, was nothing more than dust scattered among the trees. After all that had happened, after gunfire and tears, the night chases, the threats, and the silent sacrifices, what remained was not triumph, but peace. Not a peace born from forgetting, but from learning to live beside the past without letting it consume us. A few months after Victor's arrest and the collapse of everything he had built, Julian, Lena, and I moved to a small lakeside town where no one knew our real names or cared who we used to be. Julian opened a small woodworking shop, a trade that had nothing to do with power or control. And each time he ran his hand along a smooth piece of sanded oak, something in him settled, softened, allowing the peace to seep in. I took a part-time job at a community center, telling stories to children who didn't have access to preschool, sharing the magic of words and imagination. Lena made friends quickly. She laughed more, slept deeper, and sometimes even padded into the kitchen at night for water without needing to turn on the lights. A small victory against the darkness that had once threatened to engulf her. We didn't speak about our past every day, but we didn't bury it either. Some evenings, after Lena had fallen asleep, Julian and I sat on the porch, watching the moon shimmer across the lake as we shared the fears we had once hidden, the burdens we had carried in silence. Each story was a fragment of the long, arduous journey from sheer survival toward truly living. And that is what I want to share with you today, that sometimes the greatest strength is not rising after every fall, but choosing to let go of the things you once believed you needed to survive. That forgiveness is not for the person who hurt you, but for the part of you still trapped in the pain. That love begins not with grand promises, but with small, steady acts of showing up each day, offering kindness, compassion, and unwavering support. And most importantly, that no matter how dark the past has been, you always retain the right to rewrite your life, to choose a different ending, to create a future filled with hope and possibility. The story you've just listened to is not simply a battle against darkness, but a journey toward rediscovering oneself, toward finding a life that is simple yet profoundly meaningful, a life defined not by fear, but by love, resilience, and the unwavering belief in the power of the human spirit. And now I would like to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? In your own life, have you ever found yourself merely trying to survive instead of truly living? If so, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to hear your genuine reflections from the deepest part of your heart. If you found this story meaningful, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel, and share the video so it can reach others who might need a spark of hope or a quiet moment of clarity amid the noise of everyday life. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will continue bringing heartfelt stories, deep lessons, and honest glimpses of this beautifully complex world. Wishing you good health, joyful days, and the peace that comes from within.